Look at these 3 words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
Merry Christmas! And for this year, the January 6th committee is recommending indictments for President Trump and for a lot of people on his team. But before we jump into that, welcome once again to Remedial Civics with the Lex Rex Institute for, I guess, a Christmas episode, although it's not, probably not the best present that you could hope for. But anyway, this program picks up where the public education system left off, because as we've talked about before, people really have not been taught constitutional education in our country for the past 80 years. And boy, does it show. I think that, you know, Thompson and Cheney and the rest of them really could have benefited from some constitutional education. So hopefully they're watching this. They might be, you know, given...
Well, someone is.
Yeah, somebody is. But anyway, all right, so want to jump into that?
Sure. So,
it's introductions first. Alexander Hobber Bush, president of the Lex Rex Institute.
Alex Bostic, I am a legal assistant at the Lex Rex Institute.
And director of the Open Book Project.
Yeah,
Alex downplays what he does with us, but Alex is very involved, and that's a really important project we're working on. So thanks for spearheading that.
Sure thing. Okay, so the January 6th Committee.
Yeah, it's the House, I think it's called the House Select Committee on January 6th, or something like that. It's a really long name.
So what have they been doing? I've heard they had a few decisions this Monday or throughout the week.
Yeah, well, so on Monday, they finally basically wrapped up their work that they've been doing. They've been conducting hearings, hearing testimony, reviewing evidence, supposedly, about things related to the January 6th Capitol break-in. And, trying to find who to point fingers at, who to blame, who to charge with crimes. So the part that everybody was kind of looking forward to is who was going to get charged and with what. So on Monday, their recommendations for who to charge came out. They're recommending charges against President Trump, which is hugely significant that a past president is being recommended for criminal charges to the DOJ. Of course, John Eastman, his lawyer, who's my former boss, actually current boss on some cases as well. So Trump and some of his key lawyers and advisors.
Yeah. Okay. What happened?
Well, the committee recommended criminal charges. So, that's a House committee. Obviously, that's legislative branch of government. They don't have any ability to investigate crimes. They only have the authority to investigate things for legislation, right? So it seems a little odd that we're getting criminal referrals out of a House committee investigation, right? And if you looked at the committee's charter, which was voted on by Congress, you might also find that surprising, because what it says, House Resolution 503, instructed the committee to investigate and report upon the facts, circumstances, and causes relating to the January 6, 2021 domestic terrorist attack on the United States Capitol complex, and to issue a final report containing, here's the important part, facts, conclusions, and recommendations for corrective measures. In other words, they're supposed to be researching things that will allow them to pass legislation to prevent similar things from happening in the future.
So that doesn't sound like a warrant would be in their purview, or even a recommendation for a warrant doesn't sound like it'd be in their purview.
Well, they're not recommending a warrant per se. What they're doing is they're saying, Department of Justice, we think these guys are bad. You ought to bring charges against them, and it's not within their purview. And it's John Eastman put out a really good statement about this, and he's absolutely right that a recommendation of this sort from the House Select Committee has no more weight than if any citizen were to make a recommendation to the DOJ that they prosecute these people. In fact, it ought to have a good deal less weight because of the nakedly partisan character that this commission's had pretty much since day one. But that's what they're doing. They're recommending the DOJ bring criminal charges against these folks.
Well, that's what I was going to lead into, is that it sounds like it means nothing if they don't have the authority to do it. Or does it?
Well, under ordinary circumstances, I think the DOJ would take a look at it, say there's zero evidence of any criminality here, and then just kind of let it go, and it would fizzle out over time. We're not really in ordinary circumstances right now. Merrick Garland is a notoriously overzealous attorney general. We're actually suing him on a couple cases right now. Our case for Mike Lindell names him as a defendant. But he is, who knows what he'll do?
Okay.
I think the fact that Trump was named in addition to the other people, I think probably makes prosecution slightly less likely, because prosecuting a former president of the United States on paltry evidence is, I think most people would recognize as kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal, yeah.
But yeah, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
If I were one of those people named, I would not be too happy about it right now.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so let's take a little bit more of an in-depth look at what findings actually came out. So we just read the enabling statute for what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to be investigating facts and circumstances so they could come up with remedial measures.
Okay.
And in fact, on a lot of the cases that we've brought against some of these investigations that the J6 Commission brought, because they subpoenaed John Eastman a few months ago, subpoenaed him to appear before them and testify. We objected, saying the testimony was not going to be on matters that pertain to legislation, right? Well, court said no, it does pertain to legislation.
Okay.
Wonder if the court still thinks that now that they've come out with their finding and there's zero legislation recommended. It's pretty much just
okay.
You ought to indict people with criminal charges. But we thought that fell well outside legislative privilege. We didn't think they had any authority to investigate that. I still stand by that, but I think people like to think the best of our institutions.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, here's the stated goal of the commission. So this is, here's what Congress, we read what Congress gave them. Here's what they understood their job to be. They said, we understood that millions of Americans still lack the information necessary to understand and evaluate what President Trump has told them about the election. So they see their role as an educational one. So they're going to do that. They're going to sort of educate the American people, I think, is how they view what Congress has told them to do.
Well, that seems, okay, this seems a little bit less, not even the same ballpark as the last thing we discussed, but that also sounds like they don't have the authority to do that.
Well, I think they certainly, you're right, educating people is well outside the scope of legislative power.
Right.
I think probably more so within the scope of their power than investigating crimes.
Sure.
Because there already is a branch of government for that.
Right.
It's called the executive branch.
Right, yeah.
They're supposed to investigate and prosecute crimes. There are specific circumstances where Congress is supposed to investigate and try crimes, called impeachments.
Right, you have to be in office for that to be.
And ironically, a lot of the things they're now recommending the DOJ charge Trump with are things that they already tried him for.
Okay, yeah.
In the last impeachment.
Right.
So they run afoul of the double jeopardy clause of the Constitution. We'll get to that in a bit. So with those, I guess, three things in mind, because there's the original prerogative that Congress gave them, which was to find recommendations for legislation. Then I guess also educate the American people about how bad Trump is.
Sure.
And thirdly, and probably most importantly, their actual purpose is recommend criminal indictments for the people they don't like.
Right.
So with those three purposes in mind, they make 17 specific findings, they call them.
Okay.
So these are findings of fact based on all the testimony they've collected, all the different records they've looked at. Here's what we now know. Okay.
Is that they've been around for what? A year and a half, 2 years? That's about a finding a month.
What's that?
That's about a finding a month. For a congressman, that sounds pretty good to me.
Well, a lot of people, sort of stalled. And so I think they say 30 witnesses all claim Fifth Amendment privileges.
Oh, wow.
A lot of people just ignored the subpoenas. That's what Steve Bannon did. That's why he ended up getting arrested for that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, sorry.
I think he had perfectly good grounds to ignore the subpoena because they weren't engaged in legislative activity, and they could only subpoena people within their legislative purview.
Right.
But anyway, that was the argument that he made that ended up not getting accepted. But I've selected 4, I think, of the most illustrative findings that the House January 6th committee made. First one is this. So, despite knowing that such an action would be illegal and that no state had or would submit an altered electoral slate, Donald Trump corruptly pressured Vice President Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes during Congress's joint session on January 6th.
Okay, so that's referencing the what was it, like 17 cases that went through, including the Texas one that tried to get to the Supreme Court. Those things beforehand.
So this one's not so much about the court rulings as it is.
I'm sorry. Weren't you involved with some of those court trials?
Oh, yeah, quite a few of them, actually. I was on Trump's post-election team.
Yeah.
I worked directly under John Eastman on all of that.
Okay.
So we were very closely involved in the strategy for January 6th, as well as, number of other legal strategies that Trump was employing at the time.
Okay.
I'm not going to get too much into that today
Sure.
because obviously a lot of this stuff is still the subject of a pending investigation, and you generally don't want to talk too much about that. One day I actually will get on here and I'll tell you what, because there have been so many just outright lies and misinformation circulated about what we were trying to do with the electoral count.
Yeah.
And one day I actually will get on here and clarify because what we were trying to do is totally above board.
Yeah, maybe a 2023 Christmas gift. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe so.
We'll see. Anyway, sorry.
I don't think, I'd probably let my opinions show more on this one because it involves a lot of cases Lex Rex is directly involved in. But I think a lot of this stuff is just totally absurd. Yeah. Anyway, the one that I just read, so no part of that is true. It's not that's not so much about the cases as it is the actual count that took place on January 6th. But it claims, firstly it claims no state had or would submit an altered electoral slate. That's just not true.
No.
We collected alternate electoral slates from all 5 of the contested states.
Yeah.
So, the ones where we asserted that the election had failed, that the outcome of the vote was uncertain. And because of that, we wanted to make sure that the legal rights of those slates of electors were preserved because there is an appointed day when electors have to vote. Yeah. That's defined by statutory code. They got to vote on that day. If they don't do it, you can't count them. Right. So if those state legislatures were to later change and say, look, we got it wrong, we were wrong about who won here, we did a recount and it turns out that Trump won here, we wanted to make sure that we had a legal avenue to pursue a Trump victory. Right. Because you can't win without electors who actually voted for you. So we had the electors assemble and we had them meet so that they could vote.
Yeah. Which I think we saw that on TV at the time, right? Everyone was watching the January 6th session, and they had someone from each of the states say, "Oh, we have more electors we want to bring up."
Yeah.
Right.
So that's just absurd to say that no state had or would submit an altered electoral slate. They already had submitted altered slates.
Right. We saw it.
There were 2 slates of electors from at least 5 of the states.
Right.
So that's just patently false. Yeah. Donald Trump corruptly pressured Mike Pence to refuse to count the electoral votes. That's wrong. And if they read any of our emails, they would know that. Sure. Which they claim they did.
Right.
So
memorandum and such.
Yeah. And so the next one, without any evidentiary basis and contrary to state and federal law, Donald Trump unlawfully pressured state officials and legislators to change the results of the election in their states. So that's what I was referring to 2 seconds ago. So part of what we were doing, part of the effort to remedy what we perceived as widespread electoral irregularity. I'm not going to say fraud because that gets us pulled off YouTube. But there were state violations of election law.
Sure.
That's uncontestable. States did not follow the laws that had been put in place by their state legislatures. A lot of that was because of COVID-19. They sort of implemented ad hoc solutions. Secretaries of state a lot of times were the ones doing this. Well, that's constitutionally, Secretary of State can't do that unilaterally. State legislatures have sole and exclusive authority to determine how elections are conducted within a state. We wanted to make sure that those state legislatures were okay with the way those elections went down. And if they weren't, they had every right to change which electors that state was appointing. Because the Constitution explicitly says that the electors shall appoint, in whatever manner they choose, the legislature shall appoint electors for that state.
Also sounds like a bit of a contradiction of the first count that you read. If he pressured them, then how were there no votes?
The first one, they're saying that he knew that no state was going to submit an altered electoral slate, but he tried to pressure them into doing it anyway.
Oh, I see.
So,
okay.
So this was, we contacted state legislatures because there was a real uphill battle here.
Yeah.
A lot of these state legislatures genuinely didn't seem to know that the state legislature is the buck stop in a failed election. They thought, people vote. We kind of make the laws for the people voting, like we make those laws, but beyond that, we don't have much authority to determine how any of this goes. That's just not true. The Constitution is very, very clear that the legislature of a state shall direct the manner in which electors are appointed. They can choose whatever manner they want. They don't even have to have an election. There doesn't have to be a vote in New Hampshire if they don't want there to be. The legislature could just say, we're going to pick the Republican electors.
Okay, yeah.
So, naturally, when an election fails, who does it go back to? State legislature, because there's no way you're going to, we have a secret ballot. There's no way you're going to be able to trace who voted for whom. If an election fails, state legislature's got to be the one that makes the call. So that's what they're alleging that President Trump was doing here, contacting state legislatures to inform them of their constitutional duty. Of course, they phrase that as unlawfully pressuring them to change the results of the election.
Right. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
it's not lawful for the legislature to appoint electors, just who the heck is it lawful to do it?
Right.
No, that part's patently absurd. Next one. Donald Trump oversaw an effort to obtain and transmit false electoral certificates to Congress and the National Archives. And that's the big one. This is where
Yeah.
they think this is their ace in the hole.
Sure. Okay.
Is that when those alternate slates of electors met and voted, we took their electoral certificates and we submitted those electoral certificates to the National Archives. They think, oh, we've got you.
Okay.
That's fraud. You falsified an official document.
Yeah. All right.
You see the problem?
That it's already been.
The official one is in contest.
Yeah.
We don't know which electors are official until these issues are resolved
Okay.
in a court of the law, right? So
Right.
they're claiming, because you guys were wrong and because Biden won everywhere and is the most popular president ever, any electoral slate that's not for him is fake. Therefore, it's fraud when you present that.
Sure.
And here's the last one. Donald Trump pressured members of Congress to object to valid slates of electors from several states. So this is part of the electoral count. So this is prescribed both in the Constitution, Article 2, as well as in the Electoral Count Act. Now, there are certain constitutional problems with the Electoral Count Act. I don't want to get into that too much. But Article 2 of the Constitution specifies that the electoral ballots will be presented to the President of the Senate. That's Mike Pence. They'll be read on the floor of a joint session of both houses, and that objections from members of Congress can be raised, and then they'll be deliberated on in their separate bodies.
Okay.
So Donald Trump pressured members of Congress to object to valid slates of electors from several states. Who gets to make the determination of whether an electoral slate is valid?
Yeah, it's right, the Senate. And,
Yeah. If they say it's not valid, it's not valid.
Right.
They're the appointed court for determining the validity of an electoral slate.
Right.
We don't know they're valid until after Congress has determined that. So, a lot of this stuff I think really just sort of begs the question. So, yeah, those are their findings of fact. From that, they decide they're going to recommend criminal referrals of several people. Here's an interesting quotation. They say, the criminal referrals build upon 3 relevant rulings issued in a federal district court and explain in detail how the facts found support further evaluation by the Department of Justice of specific criminal charges. A federal district court. There's no citation here.
Okay.
Out of their 700 footnotes, they don't footnote this one. You know what federal district court they're referring to there?
I assume you know, because I certainly don't.
I do, because it's another case that I've been working on.
Okay, good.
That's
good.
That's Eastman v. Thompson. So that's a few months back, the January 6th committee subpoenaed records from Chapman University, which is where John Eastman used to teach.
Right.
He had emails that were stored there that I guess related to some of the stuff that he was doing for President Trump. And John Eastman sued so that he could block the disclosure of his personal confidential records, obviously protected by attorney-client privilege, not the sort of thing that should be disclosed to a congressional witch hunt, one would think. Well, luck of the draw, we got Judge Carter, a federal district judge, who I'm not going to impugn the integrity or character of any officer of the court.
Good.
But Judge Carter likes the limelight. Judge Carter's a guy who in 1990 put duct tape over the mouths of people in his courtroom. Just about a year ago, he's the one. Yeah, I should probably pause there.
I don't know. I just gut feeling that's illegal.
I don't actually know if he got his wrist slapped for that one, but he did get his wrist slapped because earlier this year, actually, he's the one that ordered the city of Los Angeles to provide housing for all the homeless people on Skid Row because he knew it would make big headlines.
Okay, that would make big headlines. I'll give him that.
It got reversed on appeal as an abuse of discretion.
Sure.
Because I think it was very clearly an abuse of discretion. But anyway, Judge Carter likes the spotlight.
Okay.
And Judge Carter, keep in mind, the only issue in this case was whether or not the January 6th committee had a right to John Eastman's emails.
Right.
Stored on the Chapman servers.
Right.
Well, nevertheless, Judge Carter decides in some of his rulings to have sort of peripheral language suggesting that, I think that the crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege applies, which basically means that if something's used to aid in the commission of crime or fraud, then it's not subject to attorney-client privilege.
Sure.
And says on that basis, he's going to allow for the disclosure of these documents.
Okay.
Not exactly a criminal allegation, no evidentiary findings whatsoever. There were never any hearings where evidence was heard, certainly never presented to a jury. Just the legal issue of whether or not the crime fraud exception applies.
Okay.
Well, he comments on that, and that's the best the January 6th Commission has for arguing that judges in this country have found evidence of criminality.
Yeah, okay.
That's what they're citing to here, is that Judge Carter opinion where he says, I think the crime fraud exception applies.
Okay.
Which is basically his only way that he can give Congress the records.
Right.
So if he wants to find that way, if he wants to give them the records, he has to find based on crime fraud.
Right.
That's the best evidence January 6th Committee has here. And so they say, based on that, based on the relevant rulings issued by a federal district court, they're going to explain in detail why they are recommending charges to the Department of Justice. So that's your basis for the criminal charges.
Sure. Okay.
Hopefully that clarifies some of that.
Yeah. Okay. So they've done criminal charges. They did education. I think you might have said this earlier and I missed it. But have they recommended anything to Congress for passing a law regarding January 6th?
You know, they did. Actually, there's one brief bit about that at the end where they say, finally, this report identifies a series of legislative recommendations, including the Presidential Election Reform Act, which has already passed the House of Representatives. So yeah, they're saying you ought to pass this bill that has already passed the House. Yeah. And what's the other problem with this? Well, aren't they recommending these folks be charged with violating the Electoral Count Act?
Wait, no, I didn't catch that. Wait. So they haven't passed the bill that they're saying they should be charged with?
They're saying the way we prevent this from happening again is we pass a new bill.
Yeah.
While on the other hand saying, yeah, but they violated the law that we already have.
So we don't need the
bill.
bill.
Which is it?
We don't need it. Yeah.
So anyway, we've already mentioned the double jeopardy issues with President Trump, but I want to go over some of the actual charges they're recommending, just so that you can see the kind of stuff that they're recommending here. There's a number of conspiracy-related statutes that are charged. I'm not going to get too much into depth on those, but basically what those come down to is you have to show that some kind of bad act was planned, some kind of illegal act, and then you show they worked with other people to do it. Right. And then you can charge the conspiracy statutes. But the substantive statutes here are going to be obstructing an official proceeding. That's 18 United States Code Section 1512C. Okay. And that reads, whoever corruptly or otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so shall be fined or under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. So I think you could probably guess the official proceeding that they're alleged to have obstructed is the electoral count.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly how President Trump is alleged to have done that.
It'll be interesting for them to explain that. Yeah. I'd say anyone that is on the indictment.
Because the plan, even if you accept their findings of fact, aren't they asserting that the plan was for Vice President Pence to just read these alternate slates of electors instead?
Right.
Doesn't that depend upon the proceeding not being delayed?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know what their evidence is for that one.
Sure.
None of their findings of fact really seem to support that. Next, we've got incite, assist, or aid and comfort in insurrection. Anyone who incites, sets foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States or the laws thereof, or gives aid or comfort thereto. So, they've been referring to the January 6th thing as an insurrection a lot.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how President Trump is alleged to have helped any of the people who broke into the Capitol.
No, not as far as I can tell. Unless they mean, no?
I guess they're saying incites, right? That he incited them to storm the Capitol. When he said, you got to march down to the Capitol or whatever it was.
Sure.
Yeah, they're saying that counts as incitement. Okay. The problem is they've already tried him for inciting that.
Yeah.
That was what the last impeachment was.
Didn't work as well.
So this is subject to double jeopardy. He can't be tried for that again because he's already been tried for that. Yeah. I don't know what else they could possibly be thinking in that section. They also are recommending that they charge 18 United States Code Section 2384, which is seditious conspiracy. So that prohibits conspiracy to overthrow or put down or to destroy by force the government of the United States or to oppose by force the authority thereof, or by force prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. I'm not sure exactly which facts support that one.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. Conspiracy to overthrow, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump wanted to stay in office.
Yeah.
I don't think he wanted to abolish or overthrow the government of the United States. I think he just wanted to run it.
Right, well, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, that one. So yeah, it's the other conspiracy statutes. So one of them is make a false. So this is actually the big one, the one that I referenced earlier. This is the one that relates to submitting the electoral counts to the National Archives, and that is conspiracy to make a false statement. That's 18 United States Code 371 and 1001, and that is whoever in any matter within the jurisdiction of the executive, legislative, or judicial branch of the government of the United States, knowingly or willfully, 1, falsifies, conceals, or covers up any trick, scheme, or device a material fact, or 2, makes any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or misrepresentation. Or 3, makes any uses of false writing or document knowing the same to contain any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or entry.
Okay.
So they're arguing that by submitting a quote-unquote false slate of electors to the National Archives, that President Trump, John Eastman, I'm missing the last person.
Doesn't matter, go on.
Yeah, have run afoul of this particular criminal statute.
Yeah.
So in order to conclude this, obviously they've got to conclude that President Trump knew that he'd lost the election at the time that he was doing these things.
Right.
Because he has to know that those slates of electors are false, right?
Correct.
Even then, I think there's still a legal issue because even if Trump, say Trump did know that he'd actually lost the election,
right.
The authority to determine the outcome of a state still rests with the state legislatures. Now, we know there was electoral irregularity in some of these states.
Right.
So he hasn't lost the election until those legislatures have said so.
Yeah.
So, I would say even if Trump knew that there was not sufficient widespread fraud to mean that he lost the election,
Yeah.
I don't think it's sufficient to bring a prima facie case on this.
No. That's a good point. Because you, in order to know, it would have to have already been settled, which is the entire thing that was occurring on January 6th was for the Senate to...
Trying to use the lawful means available so that we can settle the dispute.
It's a logical impossibility.
It's logically impossible for him to have violated this. Right? Yeah, because empowered elements in our government had not yet made the determination of which slate of electors was the real one.
Right.
It's not the fake one until after that takes place.
Right, yeah. Okay.
So it's, this whole, from beginning to end, this whole thing shows kind of a shocking ignorance of how our electoral system works.
Yeah.
There has to be a vote of the Electoral College. And then even at that point, sure, the Electoral Count Act says that I think it's the slate sent by the governor is the one that controls, but that's not in the Constitution. In the event of a disputed election, in fact, this has happened before in 1876, I think in some of the southern states, one slate of electors was sent by the governor and another by the Secretary of State.
Okay.
Which is the reason why they passed the Electoral Count Act,
Right.
because there's no clear constitutional answer on this, which one of those two controls. That has to be answered by somebody.
Yeah.
Now, ultimately, we know that it can be answered by Congress during the electoral count,
Right.
which is what President Trump was trying to do. But until then, there's not been a determination.
Right.
The mere fact that the media says that somebody's won an election on election night does not mean that person's won the election.
Right.
They have to win when the electoral votes actually, the electors get together. They actually count. So that's, usually in December, I forget, it's like the first Tuesday in December, I think.
Yeah.
The electors get together and they vote. Now,
Right.
you can have faithless electors. They can vote for somebody other than who they were pledged for.
Right.
That can change the outcome of an election. After that, those slates of electors have to be submitted to Congress. They then have to be counted by Congress. The outcome can change then.
Right.
Because one of those states could be contested. They could say, I think there was a failed election in that state. I think there was widespread fraud in that state. Whatever it is.
Right.
That's at least a conceivable possibility.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my broad conclusion on all this is, for those out there who, I guess, for those on the January 6th committee, if we genuinely did have a failed election, if genuinely there were irregularities sufficient to constitute some kind of consideration by some kind of empowered body,
Right.
what would you want the person contesting the election to do? How are they supposed to go about this?
Yeah.
I think really the reason why these recommendations are so troubling to me is that this is absolutely going to establish a standard going forward where people are going to be afraid to challenge any election.
Right.
It's not going to matter how fraudulent that election was. They know that if you do that, if you challenge the results of that election, this is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah.
I think that's a very dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah.
We want people to question authority in this country. And that's, I think that includes elections.
Yeah.
So
we want them to have a legal avenue to decide those contentions.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, well, and that's
if we
what
scare
we did.
people out of doing it, then you'll essentially not have one. So then that leaves alternatives that are much worse.
Well, I mean, first step, obviously, we filed in court. We filed in courts all across the country because we wanted to make sure that courts of competent jurisdiction were hearing all these cases.
Right.
Now, one of the big lies that's been spread around is that all of those cases found against President Trump, they didn't find any evidence of fraud or irregularity. I did the research on this, but I think there were 96 total cases that we had.
Oh, wow.
You know how many of those cases actually reached the merits?
I do not.
I think it's like 4.
Okay.
All the rest were thrown out on procedural grounds.
Yeah.
Usually either because they weren't ripe or because they were moot, which is contradictory. We don't need to get into that. But it's if something, ripe means it's not yet ready for a case. If it's not ripe, that means there's no case in controversy yet because there hasn't been any harm yet.
Okay.
So the election hasn't taken place.
Yeah.
If it's moot, it was because the election had already taken place.
Right.
So, contradictory things there. Most of them were thrown out for one of those two.
Okay.
Which, again, not reaching the merits of the case. Only 4 of them were actually heard on the evidence. And of those, I think 3 of them found in President Trump's favor.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So those numbers might not be exactly right. We'll put links in our description.
Sure.
Because I did the research on that again a couple of years ago when we were countering that lie. But that's first thing we tried was the legal means. Judges didn't want to hear it.
Right.
Because no judge wants to contradict what happened on election night.
Yeah.
You can hardly blame them, but that is their job.
Yeah. Okay.
And the next means that we tried was through the electoral count, which is Article 2 of the Constitution. I think, I don't know. I don't see that President Trump has done anything that's outside the confines of presidential power as defined by Article 2. So that's my opinion.
So that's it.
Yeah, I guess that's all for this week. A little longer than usual. Merry Christmas, everybody. Hopefully you're not getting indicted with anything this Christmas.
Sure.
So hopefully, I don't know. That's a lot to cover. And that's kind of the travesty of it is they know that most people don't know all this stuff and that it requires a fairly large breadth of knowledge to understand it. And they're kind of preying on that, I think.
Right.
But hopefully you know a little bit more now. We will get into more detail on this stuff in the future. So thanks for watching, everybody, and have a Merry Christmas.
Good night, everyone.